Now we come to one of my favorite practices, which is bending the rules of perspective and playing around with shapes and forms to exaggerate their plasticity, which can be rigid or smooth, open or closed. This is a little bit hard to explain with words, so why don't I show you what I mean? This is where you get to express your ultimate freedom of expression, which can be contained within these simple shapes. Now, geometric shape manipulation, the way I see it, is what you're seeing right now. The ability to freely flow on paper with volumes and having the relationship between the rigidity of a geometric volume or a geometric structure like a cube or a pyramid or whatever sort of polygon you want to take, and sort of allowing it to melt and remold essentially in your hands. Now you can see with this technique of shading, I'm also structuring and kind of defining this particular sculpture, and it is a way for me to stretch my ability to visualize the internal sort of images of what I want to demonstrate on a piece of paper in a very abstract sort of way. Abstract in terms of geometry, in terms of form, and these kinds of exercises can be done without any context. You can also double check with these guides to make sure that whatever you're drawing has a believable sort of shape that is true to the relation of space in which you want to put it. Now, let me give another example here. You can also structure, or rather build these shapes in a very rigid manner by using very stark lines, and kind of imagine how you would break down and chip away at a marble block. This is kind of the example that I'm trying to show you, that you can not only be free-flowing with your shapes, but also you can be quite decisive in terms of your creation. Even the shading can accentuate the rigidity and the stark nature of this particular kind of shape. Now, there's a difference of language in terms of plasticity, which is an interesting subject to learn, and I'm hoping that I'm able to demonstrate to you on paper the difference between these different types of languages. Now, keep in mind, you can, again, put these shapes within the perspective guidelines that are representative of any type of perspective, whether it be 1-point perspective, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And in this particular case, I chose to sort of mold this rigid shape within that sort of a field of vision where our perception is similar to how a fisheye lens would see the world. Now, as opposed to this type of rigid structuring, I can also let my pencil flow absolutely freely over the surface of paper, and you can see that this process is almost akin to how you would try and find your way through a fog. I'm slowly finding my way through these squiggles and kind of defining more and more different kinds of shapes, solidifying them as I'm going through this process. And again, this right now may not make much sense, but essentially this is a crucial part of any drawing process when you're drawing any sort of subject matter. You're never really super clear or super defined like a printer. You're more like a person looking through the landscape and kind of searching your way on paper to find the clearest and most true representation of whatever you're trying to express. And in this particular case, this can be an abstract sculptural shape with a very particular and specific type of plasticity and its language. In this particular case, this being very organic, soft, in contrast with the previous shape that is to the left of us. And again, I am able to do this while keeping this shape sort of positioned within a perspective, in this particular case, a 2-point perspective, just to demonstrate to you that this can be like a simultaneous relation of the chaotic process of discovery, these sort of type of shapes, and also the ability to maintain the structural reality of volume within the particular perspective or particular kind of viewing angle that you choose to decide to draw this organic shape within. Now I'm defining these lines a little bit more, outlining the silhouette, and you can go with this process as far as you like, but you can also look at this example and kind of stop at this level. Now, you can see the difference between the organic nature and the rigid nature of these two structures. Now, hopefully this can serve you as an example of what you can do with different types of shapes and forms and their natures. Now, let me show you a couple of more examples of different kinds of forms that you can experiment with. These are what I like to call standing, floating, and laid down shapes. And I'm starting with a standing shape. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can see that I'm drawing very intentionally a silhouette of a particular kind of a sculptural shape that seems to have legs that are essentially resisting whatever weight is put upon them, and there's a relation between this shape and the floor on top of which this particular shape is standing. You can see it's more pronounced in its verticality, and that way the character of this shape is very clearly looking like it is very much resisting the force of gravity and trying to erect itself from the surface that it is standing on. You can define these shapes in different kinds of manner and in different kinds of ways. But let me just move on to another example. Now, what do I mean by floating? Well, as opposed to the shape that is above, this shape is essentially detached from any kind of force that might be affecting it. So there's no ground, there's no necessary sort of gravity that is affecting this. Therefore, you can see that the plasticity of this shape is ever flowing in all of the directions, and the examples of these shapes can be open or closed. Now, you can see if you follow along, these curves have a direction where almost all of them sort of tend to curve out and inwards, back towards the center or the core of the shape, making this sort of form a little bit more closed in its nature, in its type of character. There are differences, and I can show you based on some of the more prominent artists like Isamu Noguchi or Konstantin Brancusi, how their shapes can be very different in terms of how they are formed and sculpted, because you can see some of these examples are very closed and very geometrically solid and sound, as opposed to, for instance, Isamu Noguchi's, where these particular shapes and parts and ligaments of these abstract sculptures are seeming to grasp at and outwards to the outside world, the outside space. And again, with me now, the shading technique that I'm using is an alternative type of shading that is kind of, I like to call squiggly kind of shading. You can also try and use this for your shape manipulation exercises, which can be a lot more free-flowing and allow you to make a little bit more mistakes without, catching too much attention, as opposed to when you're trying to really smoothly hatch out very unidirectional and parallel hatchings. Now, you can see I'm going to draw the inference of these lines and these shapes drawing themselves inwards and towards the core. This is what I mean by closed. There are a lot more ways that I can express this, but let me move on to the final example that I want to show you, the sort of laid down shape. Now, as the name suggests itself, and from what you might have guessed at this point, it is a kind of form or shape or whatever kind of sculpture that you can imagine that is on paper, which is very much close and almost prostrate towards the ground, as opposed to a standing shape. It is almost hugging it and laying down in its plasticity. Now, why do you want to do this? Well, this will come in handy when I'm going to be talking about and showing you examples of how you can imagine and reimagine different kinds of subject matters. Now, you can see all the different kinds of examples that I went through in terms of shape manipulation. These three examples are quite interesting in terms of their representation, but let me show you a couple of more. Now, in terms of standing and floating and laying, there are a lot more ways you can express this plasticity, and I would encourage you to be free, playful, and explorative with how you can express the freedom of your artistic expression. And to show you, just as an inspiration, a couple of examples from the prominent artists, you can see that there is almost no limit to how you can play with these kinds of shapes. So, this is it for now.